Democracy. What is it? Where did it come from? Why do all the other girls hate it? And is it here for the right reasons? These are the questions asked by filmmaker Astra Taylor in her latest documentary feature, What is Democracy?, which premiered in New York on Wednesday at IFC. Here's a brief clip from the trailer.
Do you live in a democracy?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you vote?
No. No, I do not.
If there's one issue you think is undermining our democracy, what is it?
Great question.
Everywhere you look, democracy is in trouble.
How do you make democracy out of an undemocratic people? That's our problem today.
Democracy, it doesn't feel like this in my head. It doesn't feel like being scared for my life.
Astra Taylor, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you started working on this film pre-2016 elections, is that right?
Yes. Oh, yes. I wrote the first email to my producer in 2013 and started shooting at the end of 2015.
So what was the impetus for your wanting to explore democracy?
I've always been a very political person, somebody interested in social justice, but I was specifically, there were two things. I was involved in Occupy Wall Street. And so we'd go down the street, the classic chant, this is what democracy looks like, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I would go, we need it to look like so much more than this, right? We need to govern, we need to make our society more just. So yes, democracy is a protest, but it also has to be more. And so I felt that we knew what we were against, concentrated wealth, inequality in all of its forms, but did we know what we were for and how we would do it? And then I also wrote a book about the internet called The People's Platform that was sort of debunking the Silicon Valley claim to democratize everything. And so then I was like, well, what would a democratic internet be, So this word democracy was coming up in my activism and my writing. And I just felt that it would make a really interesting topic for a movie because it would naturally allow for all sorts of voices. And I think that's what documentaries do really well, is they show people. Some people are against talking heads, but I love conversation. I love people. And so this film is just full of different kinds of people. And I asked them this question, what is democracy? Which is such a basic question. It's almost an embarrassingly simple question, but it's really important. It's become a lot more important since I started working on it.
Absolutely. Did it shift at all when Trump was elected?
I think I thought it would, right? So there's this fear like, oh my God, I've spent all this time working on this film and now Donald Trump is the president. But what was actually interesting is how all of the issues that I had been investigating all it did was make them more timely. The big questions of political philosophy that the film engages with, who rules, who are the people, how do we make decisions, who's left out, what are borders? All of these questions just took on a new urgency. The film looks at Plato and the Republic, which warns about the way that the rise of the demagogue happens when there's this divide between the rich and the poor. And basically Plato says, and the city will split into two cities, right? So here we have this demagogue. So actually, Trump just made things more timely. And so the challenge actually was just not focusing on him because that's the reality we're living in now where each tweet gets so much attention, and to actually take a step back and say a lot of our democratic challenges didn't begin in November 2016. They go way back. And we have to think about them. We have to wrestle with them. We have to struggle. Our problems are deep. Problems with racism, problems with capitalism. These aren't problems that started recently.
Absolutely, and hopefully he'll be but a blip
yes.
in the long continuum of history.
Of human history,
That's
exactly.
Right. And also, in the middle of this process, you became a U.S. citizen. Is that right?
Yeah, so I'm Canadian. The film was produced by the National Film Board of Canada, and they were co-producers on my last film, which is called Examine Life, which is a series of walks with philosophers. So I make films pretty rarely, but we got a through line here.
Yeah.
I have philosophical cinema kind of down. If you need a nerdy movie, I'm your director. But I've lived in the U.S. since I was a kid, but I was a green card holder, so I became a citizen only 6 months ago. It actually turned out I proved that I had always been a citizen all along, which is a really interesting thing. And the question of citizenship is central. I mean, it's also a theme in the film. Who is included in the demos? What does it mean to be a citizen, right? How do you become included when you've been excluded? When we associate citizenship with voting, and democracy has to be so much more than that. So these questions, I was sort of living them personally, and then I was also exploring them in a cinematic context.
Yeah, did it influence your filmmaking at all as you were, doing the requisite study for the citizenship exam?
I started to think about it because I think what it made me realize is that my whole life, because I was disenfranchised in the place I lived, and so in Canada you can't vote if you've lived far away for too long, and so then here I can vote because I had a green card. So I think for me, democracy was always more than voting, right? I had to find other ways to have a voice, other than just sort of casting a ballot every 4 years and thinking, okay, my work is done. So I was an activist. I'm a writer. The art I make has a social conscience. So I think then when I went to vote, I was like, oh, is this what people think democracy is? Just like waiting in line at a school and filling out some dots. And so for me, I think that's why the film has a very expansive concept of democracy, and it says, yes, of course, it is government. It is who represents us. But you don't see, for example, in the film, you don't see people voting. So the film is called What is Democracy? But you don't see people voting. You don't see the White House. You do see some representatives. You do see structures of government. It does talk about how do we structure our democracy, who's counted, who's not. But then part of the argument is we need to expand democracy into all these other realms of life, the workplace, our schools, hospitals, and healthcare, right? Like democracy needs to go much deeper. It needs to be part of the fabric of our lives, and it's something that we do. It's not just it's not just these rules that then we just sort of polish and protect and keep cordoned off from the rest of life.
So in the film, you talk to everyone from Cornel West and Angela Davis to people on the street.
Yeah.
What do you think the average person thinks democracy is?
A lot of people, if you just ask them, they don't have a really deep, profound answer to the question of what democracy is. It's a hard question. And I think people might have more of one now because there's this pervasive sense that we're in a political crisis, right? And there's a lot of turmoil. But when I was shooting the film, some people would say freedom or elections. And some people couldn't define the word at all. And so I think, to me, that was symptomatic. It's not, for me, it's not like, oh, the people are so... this just proves that people aren't worthy of democracy. To me, it's actually a symptom of the fact we live in a society where democracy isn't that much something we do that much of, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not something people really experience at the job or in their schools. So, it's not really a surprise that it's not something people have a very deep conception of. At the same time, when I dug, so then I would really sit with people and I would approach everyone I interviewed as though they were a philosopher, right? Capable of thinking and contemplating. And once I dug into the issue with them, people would say really profound, interesting things, right? So they might not just have a definition on hand, but they could really connect political issues to their lives.
What was something that someone said that really surprised you?
So I did one scene with some middle schoolers from an after-school program in Miami, so from a really poor school district. And what I did was I just connected the issue of democracy to their education and to their school. And they had a really astute analysis of power, of race, of class. And these are kids who are like 12 or 13 years old, So I think, people actually, part of what the film, I hope, shows is that there's all this capacity. There's all this democratic potential that we're not really unleashing in our society.
Churchill famously once said, and I will paraphrase, that democracy is the worst form of government, except, of course, for all the others. Do you think that democracy is the form of government that we should stick with? Are you leaning more socialist, fascist? Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, democracy would be socialism, right? Mm-hmm. But to me, if you say, okay, well, what is democracy? It's socialism. That doesn't solve the problem of thinking through what it means for the people to govern themselves, right? Who makes decisions? How do we do it? I would say actually that democratic socialism would actually make these questions of democracy even more urgent, because right now in my opinion, it's pretty obvious what we need to do, right? 8 men control half of the world's wealth, right? 8 billionaires. So that's totally unacceptable in a system that claims to be a democracy, right? We have an oligarchy. And, that sort of economic imbalance undermines the political equality democracy demands. So I think, it's like, and if you poll people, look at how high the approval is for this idea of a 70% marginal tax rate, right? Mm-hmm. So we can say, racism's bad, sexism's bad. Let's undo economic inequality and share the wealth. But then we'd still have to figure out how do we govern ourselves. If we could solve all of that, democracy would still be messy. We'd still have to say, okay, well, does this workplace have control? What about the community? Like, how do we manage environmental resources and scarcity? How do we how do we account for the people who aren't born yet and generations to come? So, like, the question of democracy is not going to go away, even in a much more economically egalitarian world. And so this film doesn't pretend there's an easy answer. It's like we have to keep thinking. We have to keep working on it. So democracy to me, the title is a question because there is no answer. It's something we have to wrestle with collectively forever.
So that's a spoiler that there is no answer.
That is a spoiler.
Yep. Okay, see it
and
anyway.
No car chase.
So you mentioned some heavy hitters who you interviewed.
Yeah.
Is there someone alive or dead who you really wish you could have brought into the film?
Oh my God, I live my life reading books by like all these people who I admire so much who are no longer in the world. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft would be great. I would love to interview Rosa Luxemburg. I would love to interview Karl Marx. I mean, James Baldwin. Oh my God, so many. If only I could figure out how to bring them back so I can talk to them.
You also have a companion book coming out that I think addresses things on a bit more of a grand philosophical spectrum. So tell us a little bit about the book. When's it coming out? What's it called?
Yeah. So as I was making the film, I also worked on a companion book because cinema has its own language, right? It's a visual medium. So much of it is about showing and not telling. And I wanted to make a film that had a voice that was inviting, that questioned, that made space to hear others. It's not just about me and what I think, right? The film is democratic in its form. And I wanted to make a film that was a pleasure to watch. But I had all of these thoughts, all of these, opinions and all this history I wanted to convey. So I wrote a book called Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone. That's coming out in May from Metropolitan Books. It's out May 7th. And that's where I really flesh out all the contradictions and paradoxes and the history and the possibilities that I think they're implicit in the film, but because of what a film is, I couldn't make them explicit.
And tell people where they can see the film.
So the film is playing at IFC Center. Sunday night, there will be a guest appearance with Dr. Cornel West, so that'll be great. Please come see it. Maybe it'll be held over, and people can book the film actually in their communities, in their schools, by going to Zeitgeist Films, the distributor.
Terrific. Thank you so much for joining us.
Cool. Thanks for having me.